happy to have people in the group that are in ministry somehow. I think that's really cool. Um, and I'm kind of interested in reaching out more. Oh, here's Spencer. Because I've come to think that, maybe the perspective from outside is is important, for people inside that field. Linwood, Washington, Alabama, from all over the place. Oh, like you went to K-State. Andrew, you went to K-State as an undergrad. Cool. Did I have you in class at all? Do you remember?
Yeah, I had you for environmental political
Yes.
thought
Yes.
and social, or it was an intro political philosophy class.
Yeah, I remember you. I remember your face. Thank you. Thank you for coming and welcome. That's cool. I think you might be my only former student here. All right, well, I'll wait another couple minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and put the announcement that I devised ahead of time. I'm going to drop it into the chat. And if we have a lot more people come, Brian, if you could kind of repeat it at some point. Let's see. So basically, because I have people here from all over and you found this class through a lot of different means, you might not be aware of everything I do, but if you've hung in this long on this class, you might be interested in some of the other things that I do. So actually, I got started in this line of work, if you want to call it that, through my YouTube channel. Which happened a long time ago when Spencer asked me to do a video on something completely not related to this topic, but I did it. I'd already been recording videos for class, but I did this video, and then you know how things happen. And pretty soon I was like, well, maybe I could make one of these a week and I could use it to kind of pursue my interests. So I have a YouTube channel. It's got a lot of videos at this point. I've been doing it for several years. So if you're interested in this type of topic, I've got a lot of other material, not just on distributism, but a lot on political economics and political philosophy there. Some of you haven't found the Slack group yet. That's the first thing there. Like if you want to join in discussion and get some of the news stories that I'm posting, you can find that in the Slack group. So go ahead and join that. It's got like a 24-day, like that link expires after 24 days. So, but if you ever need back in, you can just email me. Next is like where you can find our reading and links for reading. And so if you haven't gotten on there yet, but you'd kind of be interested in reading some of what we've been talking about, you can find that in that shared Google Drive. I also have a blog. I put my video content out on iTunes and other podcast outlets as well, in case you're a podcast person. And let's see, I have a professional website as well where you can see what I've published. So if you're interested in some of the books that I've published, you can go there. And then also I'm trying out live streaming through Hago. And I've just gotten started with that, but you can follow me on Hago if you want to kind of see what I'm doing there, which so far isn't a whole lot, but you never know. All right, so before I get started on this week's topic, first of all, I just wanted to see if there were any questions or anything I missed in sort of this housekeeping stuff too. Any questions or concerns you guys have now that we're in our third week? Believe it or not, like this is the midpoint. Here comes Emily. All right. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started then. This is a topic that is like very important to me, very near to my heart, let's say, and my, I guess my interests, because it has to do with what we now call sustainability and quality of life. But I'm going to talk about this through G.K. Chesterton. Um, but I'm not going to do like a whole history of Chesterton. Um, oh, Jeremy, there he comes. Speaking of Jeremy, and I wanted to thank Bryant again for being back and sort of helping helping with the questions. So he'll be reading them like he did the first time. It looks like we've got somebody else here. Uh, but also I wanted to say I will be interviewing Jeremy Cowan soon. Jeremy is on this call, and Jeremy is a professor of horticulture with a specialization in organic agriculture. And so I thought it'd be a good time to interview him, and that interview will appear on my channel, and it'll be about the ideas related to distributism. So you might want to watch for that. And then Spencer has promised me he's going to be doing a thorough review of the book Native by Caitlin Curtis. So if you're interested in that, watch out for that on my YouTube channel as well. All right, all that being said, so G.K. Chesterton. All right. I'm not going to give you a big history of G.K. Chesterton, but I want to just say, first of all, a few caveats or warnings, because mental blocks and prejudices get involved in this type of learning. And, you know, this was the case for me. I avoided G.K. Chesterton for years simply because he was kind of, in my mind, this old, you know, cigar chomping Englishman who, you know, was super old fashioned and kind of curmudgeonly and like, you know, what could I possibly learn from this old fashioned man? I'm glad I finally decided to go ahead and read uh, Chesterton, particularly on distributism. But he is depicted by a lot of people as this sort of grandpa figure, this old-fashioned retro time out of time type of person. And Dale Ahlquist, as I was looking through like videos on Chesterton to see what other people had done, I found Ahlquist's videos, which splice like somebody doing an impersonation of Chesterton with Ahlquist's narratives. He's an EWTN figure, that is, Ahlquist is. And the way that he depicts Chesterton is like extremely old fashioned and frankly goes along with his worldview and ignores the parts of Chesterton's thought that don't go along with his worldview. So even though Ahlquist is the head of, I think it's called the Chesterton Society, the Chesterton that you get from sources like that is going to be kind of one-sided and is going to give you this very nostalgic feel. But frankly, we don't need any more nostalgia. And I don't think that Chesterton would have appreciated being treated as a sort of nostalgic feel-good figure. Okay, so that's warning number one, is that Chesterton had some fairly radical things to say. He had a pretty cutting view of some of the shibboleths or idols of the day. And so we'll be talking about that. Also, another warning based upon deeply ingrained prejudice, which I used to share, and that is that farming is boring, or that talking about such things as farming and food, eyes glaze over and, like, ugh, right? So farming may be boring, I like to tell people, until you don't have enough food. And then it becomes of extreme interest. Why? Because we need food to live. Therefore, one of our problems is that we don't fully fathom that on any given day. We feel as though if we live in, at least the Northern Hemisphere, and if we're doing fairly well, we feel like that will never be a problem. And we don't know why anybody would want to concern themselves with it. And we also tend to think that people who do farming are obviously worse off than the rest of us. and that, you know, normally people wouldn't do it unless they had to somehow, because it's not a desirable way of life. In the United States, a lot of farming families actually think that, you know, for a long time, kind of encourage their kids to leave leave the profession. But it's not necessarily boring. And in any case, it's pretty dang important. Okay. So those are a couple of caveats to try to like keep your mind open to Chesterton, to try to keep your mind open and awake to these questions that have to do with food production and our food sources, because food is literally, you know, food and water are the things that we need to live. So in my mind, they should be of absolute paramount importance. There's nothing more important for human beings than access to both of those things. And so the questions related to that access should be of the utmost importance to us. Okay. So during Chesterton's time, at the time that he wrote this book, The Outline of Sanity, this was the 1910s. Uh, and, you know, he was observing this great urbanization that had occurred. And he was put off by a couple of things. The, the packing of people into cities was one thing that he complains about in this book. Like he calls it these high rises stacking human beings to where they hardly even know, you know, don't have their feet touch the ground. But he was even more put off by um, the economic disparities that he was seeing. Okay, so you had, you know, people like this that you're seeing there living a pretty high life in the cities, but you also had the other half, people who were living in destitution. And these were people that had previously engaged in subsistence farming, who had previously lived in rural areas. And Chesterton argued, and I think it kind of seems like common sense, that it may not have been, their lives may not have been perfect, but they were probably better off where they had been as opposed to where they now were. So we talked about last time about the, you know, the great migration, or really the great throwing off of people from the land and their migration into the cities. So now we're looking at the results of this, and it basically meant slums. It meant, you know, people barely eking out a living, sharing their living quarters in these dank, dark, unhealthy places, child labor, female labor at a time when that was still, you know, looked upon questionably. Children and women paid far less than men, the entire family working and still not being able to get by. So this great contrast between those who had so many resources and these people were many more, right? That really bothered Chesterton. And he wondered to himself, wouldn't these people have been better off had they never left their prior situation? Would they not be better off now if they could move back to something like that, right? And so the question for him in the Outline of Sanity is there any way to make that happen, to kind of reverse that shift in society's priorities and reverse that shift in migration back towards the countryside so that more people could live off the land? This book, The Outline of Sanity, that I'm drawing from, was published in the same year that the Titanic was launched. And of course, it sank the same year it was launched. And everybody knows the story of the Titanic, but this was this huge monument, supposedly, to human ingenuity. And as you know, it was the maiden voyage, highly prized, a lot of very wealthy people on board enjoying the very best of modern everything. And the people down below in steerage, they were the first to die when this thing sank, of course. So to me, it kind of symbolizes, the Titanic symbolizes the spirit of this era and some of the social problems related to this era, both in what people valued, in also in the in the fascination and love and enthrallment with newness, with technical progress, and this sort of naive belief that human beings could do anything, including constructing this gigantic ship that would be totally safe. People were told that it would be unsinkable. And then, of course, it sank in its maiden voyage. Things like this. And of course, World War One kind of put people over the edge in their questioning of whether technical progress would actually benefit mankind. The book was written before the 1929 stock market crash, but we have to remember, the historical context here. 17 years after this book was written, you had this devastating crash that happened because of all of the new innovative ways in which people were investing their money, and these corporate powers were growing, but it wasn't regulated well enough, it wasn't planned well enough. And when that crash happened in the United States first, that rippled all across the world. It was a global depression that happened. It was probably worse in certain parts of the United States than any place else, but it was a global depression. And so Chesterton did envision that possibility. What you gather from like reading Chesterton and The Outline of Sanity as well as other works is that he is very concerned about this type of possibility, that people were headed towards a real crisis based upon misplaced values, upon getting away from just the basics of, how to ensure that you are supplied with the things that you need, that you're farming in a way that is sustainable. He didn't use that term, but we do. But the farming techniques that were being used in the United States that were part of also what led up to this and that created the Dust Bowl, they were basically unsustainable. So this is all kind of the context in which he is writing. And I suggested a background reading. It's by Eugene McCarraher, who's the author of The Enchantments of Mammon. Some of you have that book. The book that I suggested you read from, and I have that up there in the drive, is Christian Critics. It's an earlier book. But in some ways, it follows the same pattern, okay? He's dealing with the 20s and 30s, and primarily with the history of Christianity in the United States and how various Christian figures dealt with these economic and technological changes. And again, you can see that at this time, early on, a lot of people, including, Christian thinkers, both Catholic and Protestant, were very concerned about how capitalism was developing. They were very concerned about whether it could survive. And so basically, if it was sustainable. So he talks about a variety of reactions on the part of Christian thinkers as a result of what appeared to be a kind of cataclysmic catastrophe for a lot of ordinary working people. Social gospel reformers who wanted to somehow reform the economic system to make sure that people were taken care of. Third way industrial democracy proposals. Those were ideas in which, and I think Catholic worker thinkers somewhat fall into this category. At least this is part of what they were concerned about, as well as distributism, is the idea that the workers ought to have more control over the workplace, that the workers in any particular workplace ought to share power with the owners, and there ought to be cooperation. So that type of idea was proposed. Also, plain old socialism was entertained by Christians and non-Christians alike, as well as the kind of the opposite of this, the idea of neo-feudal orthodoxy, that the problem was that Christians were losing truly the spirit of God, that they were going down this path of what McCarraher would call mammon. and the worship of mammon, and that the best thing to do is to kind of return to some sort of feudal situation based strongly upon the church, Christian values, getting away from materialism and so forth. And distributism, the school of distributism, then is in the mix of all of these other reactions, some of which are related and some of which are not, right? But I just wanted you to know that there were a lot of different reactions to this. And the advantage that people had in the 1910s and 20s and 30s was that the situation was new enough and it was slapping people in the face. In other words, it was quite obvious that capitalism was not working out well for a lot of people, and that it was enriching some and impoverishing a lot of others, or making their lives precarious. And so Christian thinkers naturally asked, well, what's wrong with this? Like, have people lost their way? Are they not guided enough by Christian principles? Is it a political problem? Is it a social problem? Is it a spiritual problem? But one of the cool things that McCarraher does, and I won't dwell on this, but he constantly goes back to, yeah, but despite the fact that there were a lot of these proposals and a lot of angst on the part of a lot of Christian thinkers, pastors, theologians, time and time again, you saw them kind of be co-opted too much by modernity, particularly by psychological and social scientific methodology, thinking of the church as a business, and kind of adopting the values of capitalism. And over time, like in his book, The Enchantments of Mammon, basically adopting Mammon won that battle over time. But at this point, that enthrallment to technology, enthrallment to organization, modern, psychological methods, that kind of crept into Christian theology. And it made it more susceptible to compromise with capital. I hope that's clear. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we see it to this very day. It's become extremely hard to miss, right? Churches of all kinds adopt these methods and kind of present themselves as more or less corporations or businesses. And so they've adopted, even if they're not the social gospel people, like we talked about last time, they don't necessarily hew to an emphasis on the spirit so much as an emphasis on social organization, political and economic organizations, technology, and so forth. So I think there's some questioning there in McCarraher's writing as to whether that might not have been a mistake. Okay. I want to stop basically first and see if there's any thoughts on all of this kind of introductory stuff that I've been talking about. Anything? Yeah.
Andrew has a question for you. Where would somebody like Maurras or Action Française have fallen in these categories? Would they have fallen more towards orthodoxy, or maybe something more as an industrial third way?
This I don't know because I'm not familiar with those particular movements. Could you maybe explain them a little bit?
I don't know too much. I know they were vaguely like integralist. Maybe somebody else here knows a little more about them. They were like kind of counter-revolutionary, some would say reactionary.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, I mean, if they were integralists and somewhat reactionary, that they fall into the, I guess, what I mentioned as medieval or neo-medieval or medieval, neo-feudal type of thought. That is a way of, that we still see, Rod Dreher right now, is like, had made kind of a splash with the Benedict option book. But others have kind of taken that further into a new neo-orthodoxy. It is kind of a reactionary, you might say, approach. It's very natural. It's like understandable that people would say, Maybe we need to go back to more religious structure. Maybe we need an Orthodox church, return to Orthodox Catholicism or some other form of orthodoxy, in order to kind of move back to a point where society has enough cohesion that it can actually cooperate and reject some of these materialistic values. But beyond that, if anybody else knows more about those movements in particular, please, speak up or put them in chat. Thanks for that question. Anybody else? So far, so good. All right. Well, thank you. The topic for today was the vision of work and play. And I got to warn you, this is going to be way more about work than play. As I was putting this together, I think I will probably get to what Chesterton and others in this movement might think of our leisure activities as opposed to what would be good for us. But I think that the work topic is way more important for us. First of all, just say in a nutshell that distributists like Chesterton tended to think that work should not be exploitative or menial. And by menial, I don't mean physical, I mean servile, as in, Belloc's understanding of servile, where nothing is sort of in your control. And whoops, thought I turned my ringer down. Where nothing's in your control and you're just more or less at the beck and call of others doing these mechanical tasks, okay? So work shouldn't be neither one of those, because human beings need to be involved in what they're doing at a mental level, at an emotional level as human beings, and not be simply treated like part of the machinery. Work should, in his view, produce real things. So Chesterton, in a very humorous way, if you read it, that he has a very wry kind of writing style, right? But he really looked down upon a lot of the production of his time, which even then was becoming consumerist, was producing things that people didn't need, and was driving a spending and I guess you might say, like consumption for consumption's sake. So he didn't like that, because that involves us it basically deteriorates our character to do that. So production should be for real things that actually contribute to people's well-being, and it should develop human talents and capabilities. So a lot of the jobs today they actually aim at using as little actual development of capabilities as possible, right? The idea is to automate enough, to simplify enough, to kind of cut your job into chunks that different people can handle enough so that you can kind of interchangeably take one person, they leave, you can plunk in another, and supposedly they will be able to do the job just as well, right? Chesterton thought this is not what work is for. A human being takes pride in work if they can develop their skills and abilities and offer more over time, okay? But again, if they're treated as though they're interchangeable and their skills are not needed or even wanted, or I might say, I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but a lot of times skills are actually seen as a problem, right? Either because you're overqualified and therefore you won't want that job, or you just might think too much and like challenge the status quo. So, having people who are creative or try to develop themselves may mean getting outside of the confines that your employer wants you to stay within. Just one comment on play. It should develop culture and community, the type of rural living that I suspect G.K. Chesterton would recognize, okay? In India, whereas it used to occur even in his own native land, but here, even now in 2021, there's a lot of people in India that are living this way. 58% of Indians rely on subsistence farming plus some market farming. And prior to the development of industrial capitalism, the majority of the world's people, of course, relied upon subsistence farming. Now, about 25% of the world's people rely on subsistence farming, many, if not most of them, in the global South. And that is being threatened by changes that are brought on by the globalized food system, the globalized food economy. So I don't know if any of you have heard about this phenomenon in India, but it's huge. It's a huge ongoing protest of farmers. I mean, millions of farmers. And I think it started in, I want to say September or October of last year in big numbers. I think it had been going on before then as well, but it really started to swell at that time. And even to this day, there are thousands, if not more, people outside of Delhi, farmers who are basically, you know, they're living in tent cities, and they have decided they are going to stay there, and they're not leaving until the government changes its laws, because their subsistence market farming way of life is being threatened by these changes that Narendra Modi wants or has made, has pushed through these laws that have changed the way that they've been operating since the 1960s or so. Okay. Now, before these changes, and still there's a lot of people owning small land, you know, small farms, but these changes have made it so that it's much more likely that these small farms are going to, that many of the small ones are going to go under, and that they're going to be bought by larger farms, and that farming is going to become what we in the United States call conventional, although I find that to be a very odd term because it's actually not conventional. It's you know, monoculture agriculture, big ag, basically. So they're worried that they're going to lose their farms because these old supports that the government has had in place for a long time to help these farmers out, Modi is taking away. Okay. So the reason why I bring this up, if it's not obvious already, is because these supports, that the sort of contract that the Indian government had with Indian farmers, it sustained a great distribution of a lot of small farms. It's an element of distributism at work in India, right? And so what these farmers are protesting is the end of a distributist model for farming. Distributism can't exist unless government is willing to support sectors like agriculture and to regulate it so that people don't get bought out and overrun by larger interests. Okay. So Modi is a nationalist, which again is kind of like ironic. He calls himself a nationalist, and he is a nationalist in some ways, and yet he's not a nationalist at all when it comes to economics, because you know, he's following in the footsteps of the Reagan Thatcher you know, deregulation mode, in which these people are just going to be, they're going to be thrown into this competitive environment in which the ones that have, like, for instance, access to high technology where they can market their goods through a computer, are going to win out over ones who don't. And so you can see how it wouldn't be very long before you know, these advantages bought with money would basically squeeze the smaller farmers out. So they would undergo the process that happened in the United States decades ago, right? That's what they're facing. And so they're very boldly out there. And some of these protests have gotten extremely violent. The government has responded with repression. They've attacked these people. Some of these people have been tortured. It's been really, really ugly, and it's been going on a long time. Just a little blurb from CNN. I put several stories in the Slack column having to do with current events. But it says under the previous laws, farmers had to sell their goods at auction at their state's agricultural produce market committee, where they were guaranteed to receive at least the government agreed minimum price. There were restrictions on who could buy, and prices were capped for essential commodities. 3 new laws initiated by the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi dismantled this committee structure, instead allowing farmers to sell their goods to anyone at any price. Okay, and that sounds really good. You're free to sell your goods to anyone at any price without price supports, but I hope you can see how that favors the farmers, the owners with more property, more money, who are poised and ready to compete in that freewheeling market, right? And who will then start to buy out these other farmers, who then, what'll they do? Go to Delhi and try to make a living? Yeah, I think, was there a question or a comment? I thought I saw something come up.
No, I just was reposting your links to everything again in case anyone needed to get a hold of that. While we're here, Lori, is there efforts for collectivization underway? Some sort of like a neo-populist effort within the ground swelling, or have they gone directly to just this pushback against changes? Are they trying to find ways to make changes that they can control some of this?
That's an excellent question. From what I've read, their primary mode is still to demand the government make these changes and repeal these laws. Over and over again, they say, you need to just take back these laws. The farmers are important. They're a big part of the electorate. And, you know, this needs to be changed, and you need to put back what was there before, which we could count on. As far as whether there's any kind of anarchistic, you know, move to kind of just collectivize and help each other, I haven't seen that, but I also haven't like read everything related to this. So I can't say for absolute sure that this hasn't been tried. I'd be surprised at what it doesn't get tried, or at least discussed in these circles. I mean, basically these people have been camping out for months and months and months. And this is generally where you go next if the government fails to respond to your demands, right? And these people are bold. These people are not like folks in the United States. I mean, sorry, I hope I'm not offending anybody, but like folks in the United States come out and they protest for a while and then they tend to go home, right? And, you know, like things flare up and then flames die down. But gee whiz, I mean, they're determined, like, you know, and it's interesting because the American media doesn't cover this very much. You don't hear about this on the nightly news, not as much as you should. It's phenomenal. So, but I mean, to answer your question, it seems like they're still saying, we want the system back that we had before. And Modi is basically trying to, you know, modernize India. He's trying to make India, like a lot of other countries, part of the global, the international food market. And so the emphasis is on like growing cash crops that you can store and sell abroad, and that Indians need too. But like I read another story where, you know, especially the Indian farmers that deal with perishable produce as opposed to the kind that you can store up, like the grains and stuff, they are in particularly difficult situation, right? And a lot of the government programs even before didn't really apply to them, didn't really help them as much. So India is kind of a test case that is ongoing as to whether, you know, some sort of distributist way of production can survive in our modern world. And it raises an alarming question as to like what happens to the Indian people if the protest efforts don't succeed, because the system that they had been living with for all those decades did keep them, you know, relatively better fed than before. I mean, it was actually, you know, nothing is perfect, but it was actually fairly productive. Um, so, I mean, this is just a blurb about the tractor protest, but imagine a protest in which farmers bring their tractors and their oxen and all of these different things to this place. And basically they're being kept out of Delhi proper by these huge walls of barbed wire that the government has put up to kind of contain them in one area. And they are not at all shy about bringing out the troops to suppress these folks when they get out of hand. So I really encourage all of you to check into this and learn more about it. But as it says there, they're demanding the repeal of laws passed by Parliament in September that say they will favor large corporate farms, devastate the earnings of many farmers, and leave those who hold small plots behind as big corporations win out. That's happened long ago in the United States, right? And we tend to think that, well, it's just the march of progress. You know, that's just the way it had to be. And you know what? People can retool and do many other things. So it's all good. But man, when you've got almost 60% of your population feeding themselves and other people through small diversified agriculture, you know, it could cause a catastrophe if these changes unfold. It also just, I don't know, this is kind of tangential, but you lose a lot of the local plant species when this process happens. You know, plants and animals that more adapted to the climate without having to rely upon irrigation or particular pesticides and fertilizers just to survive. Some of the plant species that people farmed and relied on have literally gone extinct in India. They may not be able to recover, but you know, if something happens to the global market, they're going to need to have that reliable source of food, and it is now disappearing. Okay. Any other thoughts on India, or you know, like anybody know more about this situation and want to add something, some information? If you
Hey,
do,
Lori.
yeah, go ahead.
I don't know that much about the actual protests, but there's another angle here that I think is useful to bring in. Vandana Shiva has been talking for 20 years about the capitalist capture of the seeds. And part of the reason, it goes with the Green Revolution, right? The Green Revolution came along and everybody thought it was great, except that the corporations own the seeds and the farmers can't then replant. And so that's a big reason for the loss of the native species and the farmers being forced into paying for fertilizer and all the rest, paying the corporations just to eat. So it's just another piece of the capitalist push that I think is worth highlighting here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for adding that. Yeah, the patenting of seeds and prohibiting people from using their own seeds, from being able to, you know, keep seeds and reuse them. So when you buy the systems from these major corporations, basically you agree not to reuse it. So it's in a sort of limbo where it's your property, but it's not really your property, right? And you're right that has led to it creates a dependency that's very difficult to extract oneself from. I have a colleague who's well, what country is he from now? Congo. He's from the Congo. And when you mention Monsanto to this colleague, he starts to get angry before he can even, like before he can even say anything, because, he basically says that the introduction of this, which oftentimes at first it's introduced as, we'll give you this for free, or we'll give this to you as aid, we'll give this to you as if for a reduced price. And then people, become sort of dependent upon these systems. And then it's a switch, change, oh, now you have to pay for this, right? You have to, now you have to pay for it and abide by all of our rules. And he also says it's just kind of devastated local agriculture in his country as well. So yes, it's a huge problem. Obviously, it's a problem in the United States too, right? I mean, yes, to the point where, as I understand it, if like the pollen of your GMO crop, like happens to be blown into somebody else's field, and the plants over there get cross-pollinated with it, the company may come and say that the other farm is violating its patent and copyright ownership of the DNA involved. So things have gotten a bit out of hand. And we have to realize these things could be affected by government. They could be changed by government. Governments can outlaw that practice if they have the political will to do so. They can regulate the power of companies like Monsanto or whatever I think it's Bayer now. But choose not to, and for maybe obvious political reasons, but a lot of these corporations are like hugely, they're big donors, they're hugely politically influential, they're hugely influential in universities, they've practically bought and paid for whole departments or colleges of agriculture, they have. And so under those circumstances, it becomes pretty hard to, regulate them. Who has the political will, right? But it's not to say that they couldn't. If government doesn't do it, who can, right? Unless we go Bryant's route and just sort of, collectivize on our own and just to say, we're doing it. Which I kind of like. I kind of like that idea. Okay, so back in his day, Chesterton did hope for legislation. He was calling for agricultural reform, basically what we would call land reform, to take that large chunk of land that had been bought up by these big owners and was, in his view, not being used well, or if not at all. And he actually called on the legislature to pass laws to kind of redistribute the property. But he basically also said, I'm not going to hold my breath and wait for that to happen. So he appealed to the large landowners themselves to take it upon themselves to give some land to people who could make it productive. So he advocated for land trusts that wealthy people could enter into to do just that. And I don't think that that was hugely successful, but it was something that he promoted. Yeah. Yeah. Why would they do that, right? So he was very interested in land reform, and he tried to move on both fronts. But I would say that, India is in a situation right now that's similar to what, well, like maybe the late 19th century, very early 20th century, right, in Europe, where there's still a memory, in fact, a practice of a lot of subsistence agriculture. And there is a intense understanding, a grasping of the threat to it posed by big agriculture. And it's still conceivable at that point in time, it's still conceivable to stop or even reverse the process in a way that it's not conceivable for, say, us in the United States or in a lot of the Western world now at this point in time to be able to even conceive that it could be possible. The problem was very evident, and Chesterton's big question in the Outline of Sanity was, could we get these people who lived in urban areas now, who lived in these slums and in these high rises, who worked in factories in situations like that, were they capable of returning to being, quote, peasants? Okay. That term is kind of loaded, like who wants to be a peasant, right? But the way that Chesterton meant the term was simply the self-sustaining family, basically, the subsistence agriculture, self-sustaining family. Yeah, Jeremy.
Oh,
Yeah,
I was
Jeremy.
raising my hand.
Yeah, yeah,
I
go
want to
ahead.
be a peasant. I
I
would volunteer to be a peasant.
You would? Why?
I perceive that as a simpler life without the stresses and anxieties incumbent in modern society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I think that Chesterton thought that a lot of people would as well. In other words, if they were given a choice, given the choice of living that life in which they're packed into flats where they don't know where their next meal is coming from because the boss may not need them. Automation has reduced jobs, or just, the precarity of their situation, and the sort of suffocating atmosphere of a lot of crowded cities, as you say, definitely complicated, less simple, less leisurely in a way. Although I think a farmer at the peak of harvest probably would say, no, I don't think we have a lot of leisure, but simpler, definitely. And Chesterton said, I think that you're underestimating a lot of these folks, right? And he, I don't know what you think of this argument, but he said, look, a lot of the people who live in these areas of the city where, you might say they're living in shacks or in substandard housing, but they still are finding a way to eke out a small garden of some kind, or they still have chickens or something like that. And then London basically encouraged started to build high rises and try to, as he says, stack people and prohibit this type of activity because it didn't look good and didn't comport with the vision of urban living, right? And so, Chesterton basically said, look, people wanted to do this. There's still this longing and desire to have something that's your own, to be able to produce it and to say, I did that, and I have the pride of feeding my family to a certain extent, of taking care of my family. I have the picture of women here because women were just beginning, this was the era of the flappers anyway, the 1920s, a little bit after this book. But, women were beginning to, in the upper classes anyway, envision, oh, maybe we can become liberated. Maybe we can also, become politically involved and maybe eventually have professions like men. And this was a time of great hope for women. And to a large extent, or maybe at least to some extent, there was a liberation of women over time. And I don't want to dwell on this because sometimes this bothers people and I get misunderstood, but I think that this hope, so much hope was placed upon the urban model and upon the capitalist model of obtaining jobs and being just like men, that I think in a way these women began to make a mistake in adopting the values associated with urbanization and the capitalist economy, and traded. Yes, I mean, the problem for women was, and to a certain extent still is, although it's way better, is subservience or being kind of dominated by men. The problem was not primarily that they could only do certain kinds of work, but they did latch on to the idea that you could like remove yourself from that subservience and domination by making money. Okay, so in the process of doing that, women also adopted that model of money is necessary. The household work that you do that like actually sustains the family is kind of worthless and nobody respects it. So making money is the key to equality. And one of the outgrowths of that was, unfortunately, the expansion of the consumer economy, because more people making money less time to like supply yourself with the things that you need through your own labor at home, equals need to buy a lot of stuff. So tragically, you know, when both parties enter the workforce, you get a doubling of labor, not any more leisure, if not less, and way more purchasing of things that basically almost necessitate work, right? So, I mean, all I'm saying this for is that I would like people to contemplate this side of women's so-called liberation, and that women's liberation did not necessarily include liberation from that thing which still oppresses us all, which is this sort of market imperative, right? And you know, it contributed to you know, the demand for endless work, consumerism, pollution, and the whole 9 yards. That doesn't make women more guilty than anybody else. It just means that we had this moment in time when we could have asked ourselves the question, how do we want to live our lives, right? Do we want to have both parties working full time, or would we like to have more leisure and sharing of work that is necessary? But instead, we now do much work for things that are not necessary. And in fact, go into massive debt because even what we work with, you know, what we make with both parties isn't enough to buy all the stuff that we think we want. Hopefully that went down okay. I am a feminist in the sense that I think women should not be dominated by men and should be equal. I am not a feminist in the sense of thinking that work is our liberation. Oh, all right. So let's talk a little bit more about this, you know, Chesterton's view of people living in these areas. I have this picture of, it's a rooftop farm gardening. It's a contemporary picture. It's not from his times, but it's a similar situation here. People, even in the most unusual of circumstances, will try to grow something, you know, and these are becoming quite sophisticated now. Like in Detroit, as I understand it, like it's a huge deal. They're growing vertically. They're growing on top of roofs. There's like community, you know, projects for community gardens where people work cooperatively. So Chesterton was noticing this, and you know, he basically argued that the so-called slum dweller was a human being who had real aspirations and who was rather beaten down, but that you could still see these glimmers of aspirations and a desire for a better life. So he says, we are told again and again that the slum dwellers of the big towns cannot merely be turned loose on the land, that they do not want to go on the land, that they have no tastes or turn of thought that could make them by any process into people interested in the land, that they cannot be conceived as having any pleasures except town pleasures, or any discontents except the Bolshevism of the towns, right? The Bolshevism of the towns, that's a reference to his notion that the towns were collectivizing people, and that the labor that they engaged in was collectivizing people, and that it was much more conceivable then for most people that there would be a sort of socialization at some point as a solution to the economic problems in front of them, rather than a return to the countryside or a return to a more self-sustaining way of life. But, you know, he is basically arguing, no, you know, people are human beings, and the type of labor that they are doing in the cities is largely dehumanizing, and so they are attracted and would maybe perhaps go do something else. Yeah, Justine.
I just wanted to say that it seems to me like this myth that Chesterton is talking about there does kind of persist today, that almost like agriculture is something that's maybe quite difficult for people to learn, or that there's this huge risk involved. I'm like a kind of like an amateur gardener myself. And I've kind of learned that even if you grow up kind of in the city or you don't have any experience with plants or anything like that, it is something that you're somehow like biologically like capable of like quickly picking up. Like it's something that is quite natural to us. And so actually, if you're able to like pick up something like how to use a computer, or, you know, how to live in the modern world. I think actually working in the garden is something you might even find more natural and easy. So I think that's kind of one of the myths that maybe need to be combated a little bit, and it's something that it seems like Chesterton was seeing at his time as well.
Oh, totally. Yes. Thank you for that. Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, Chesterton, towards the end of one of those chapters, says, you know, we're not against all machinery too, because there's this notion then as well as now that if you want to do this type of work that's small farming, maybe organic, that you're just going to be going back to the horse and buggy days, and you're going to be using an oxen and a plow or whatever, donkey and a whatever, and a hoe, and you're going to be anti-machinery. Well, some people are, like, you know, as I understand it, the Amish make do without a lot of machinery. But Chesterton was not adverse to that. He envisioned that the problem with machinery in his day, as well as ours, is that it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger to accommodate bigger and bigger and bigger production, right? So like now we have combines that are the size of freaking, you know, hotels, and no one can own them. You know, they just borrow them. So, but machinery could be scaled to the small farm. If you're right, like if we can figure out how to use computers, we could also figure out how to like create and use machinery that fits the type of production that would supply a local area with food immediately without having to have it shipped for hundreds, if not thousands of miles. It's just a matter of where we place our emphasis and what kind of technology we want to develop. I also garden. Yeah.
Sorry, hopefully you can hear me better than last time, but it occurred to me as you were saying that I'm almost wondering if Christianity and the notion of the fall, right? So when Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden and told that they were to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow, if that wasn't taken so much for its religious implications as it was as an instruction manual for society. Like now all of a sudden it's become a virtue to leave the garden and then to go work in order to earn a salary in the form of, bread in the form of a salary, and that it's become virtuous to leave the garden as a result.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I think that, that's one thing that thought brings to me is this mentality that if we leave the garden, we're leaving this, whatever you want to call it, the human condition of working by the sweat of your own brow. But what you're really doing is trading one type of work for another, right? There is a deep truth there in the biblical teaching that human beings have to work in order to survive, and they have to do difficult work. And so, but we, conceive of farming and the getting of food as a type of work that is naturally more degrading, let's say, undesirable compared to other work, right? And so we have kind of been seduced into this notion that sitting in one of these cubicles, or standing in front of a checkout counter, or being in a warehouse is superior to digging up potatoes or some such thing. But when you add in, the many costs involved in all of this, including the cost to our health, our physical health, our mental health, the pollution that it causes, which impacts our health and our mental well-being, the anxiety that a lot of this work produces, the sense of emptiness or lack of purpose. Because in a lot of cases, what are you really doing? You're doing one part of something so big in these modern corporate operations that you really don't have any ownership or feeling of even knowing what's going on. Yeah, Jeremy.
So all of those things, all of those externalities that you're mentioning, if you think of it from the economist perspective, those are all broken windows that are going to build the economy.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, you talk about the costs to our health as a trade-off of changing the type of work that we're doing, but that just enables doctors to make more money, and that's more cash that's being exchanged. That increases GDP. When we talk about pollution, now we have a problem to fix. We have another thing that we need to throw money at in order to remediate, and as a result, we're building GDP with every one of those. So the economists, you know, that whole situation, even though for individuals it creates negative results, it builds the economy, and the economists are happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said, well said. Every problem becomes another source of revenue, another expansion of another business, right? So yeah, literally, if this type of lifestyle makes us sick, then we need doctors, we need gyms, we need diet programs, we need health food, we need supplements. I mean, yes, and there's always, yeah. So I mean, and this is something that we have to confront, is that we've been told that the economy must grow, and that the only time times are good is when there's like growth, and the rate of growth needs to continue to grow, right? In order for us to all be secure, right? And that is simply like, it creates the problem that you just mentioned. We start to like thrive upon sickness, basically upon the various types of sicknesses and brokenness in our societies. And it's simply also just impossible. There is a limit, and we're beginning to see it, the limit, unless we start to basically trade in virtual things, which is starting to happen. But, you know, there is a limit that the planet can bear for the endless economic growth that we strive for. Mm-hmm. So a lot of distributists, including Chesterton, are agrarians. And to me, that just means this focus upon agriculture is kind of like the core human activity, the thing that ought to be fostered and protected, that you need to deal with first, and that actually gives people a fairly decent life, if it's done right and if it's supported by the society, and has to be supported by the government. That's why I brought in the Indian example, because, and Chesterton would agree, this is something that has to happen with the intervention of the government that keeps the economic activity related to farming within bounds and supports the farmers, okay? And so agrarianism, again, is considered kind of old-fashioned, you know, like Wendell Berry, kind of reminiscent way of thinking. But I think we need to let go of, again, that's a modernist progressive prejudice, right? And a lack of imagination. We don't have to become Amish to be agrarians, right? But we do need to grasp that literally without food and clean water, we're dead, okay? This is just, I mean, I started out the beginning of this talk making this point. It seems very, very obvious, and yet one of the most evil things about our societies today is that very few people ever have that thought even occur to them, until, like in the pandemic, you get, oh my gosh, where's my, you know, like where I can't get any pork, or I might not have enough food. And then people started to hoard. But interestingly, that deep anxiety only lasted a very little period of time. We have like multiple local farmers here who try to supply people with great fresh vegetables and meat and stuff like that. And they experienced this upswing for this very short period of time in more people wanting CSAs, which is like a food basket every week from their farm. And you know, we're buying local meat because you couldn't buy, you know, a lot of meat at the store. But now this year, way fewer subscribers, way fewer people interested, because the stores are back open. It seems like the supply's back online. So very quickly they forget, right, this threat. And they don't conceptualize the fact that in order to avoid the threat, you've got to think of things like supporting your local farmers, you know, and literally like things like growing things that actually survive in your area. Just very mundane, but very, very important things. So why agrarianism? Literally, that's the most important reason for us to think in these terms. Conventional agriculture creates about 30% of the greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. So that's another good reason, because conventional agriculture relies so much on fuel, on shipping, on changing the landscape in ways that create more pollution, more heat, you know, an over-reliance or maybe an overabundance of cattle production in particular that does this. The global food system leaves us all vulnerable to the global market. If it's disrupted anywhere, it can deeply affect everywhere else. This is not something that, I mean, not all international trade is something to be against necessarily. A lot of our current nationalists are totally against international trade. But I remember Spencer saying once, you know, it'd be one thing to get those things that you can't get in your own country from international trade. There's another thing to basically get your lettuce from, you know, several countries away. This is kind of crazy, you know? And so the global food system needs to be re-examined. There are other reasons, as Jeremy's pointed out, the agrarian life encourages stability of family and community. Like Ashraf, you know, the guy that did that tour, he had no concept of leaving his family land. He was very, very interested in continuing to stay there and live that lifestyle. And if he was bringing in money, that money was going to come back into that family unit to support and, you know, help to make their lives better. But he was not going to be moving, and that's becoming more and more rare. And as these changes happen in India, these small farmers are going to be forced to move, and those families will break up, and they will not be able to support each other anymore, and they will not have access to food right outside their door that they can feed themselves with if they need to. So for some of us, there's, you know, with this system, there's an incredible amount of hunger still because it all relies on money, okay? Which, you know, the Green Revolution was sold to the world as feeding people. And in fact, to this day, what is our College of Agriculture? Not just ours, but every one of them. It's like, oh, we're feeding the world, right? That's the slogan. Well, you might ask yourself the question, why is it so many people are still hungry and starving around the world if this revolution was designed to feed the world? Or, you know, if people are fed, why do they have to be fed through charitable efforts that ship food in? How well is that working for countries that are the recipient of food aid? On the other hand, ironically, a lot of us are getting sick and fat in other countries where we've got way too much, you know? And so this is a part of this agricultural revolution that Narendra Modi wants to bring to India. And another thing Spencer often points out, I hope, Spencer, that you're appreciating how much your wisdom I'm dispensing. But he basically often asks the question, you know, like other forms of work, are they better than this? Jeremy kind of said the same thing, you know, like, compared to what? You know, what makes agricultural work so much more degrading? Or would you not rather work under those conditions than, say, under the ones depicted here? Okay, let's see, how much time do I have left here? I've got about 10 minutes. I wanted to talk about this topic of play just a little bit. Leisure would be another word for it, but beforehand, any other comments people want to like make to this diatribe I've been putting on here?
Lori, just a quick
Yeah.
question from Miriam here. Could other cooperative forms of sociality, not only in terms of land ownership, but in shared risks or shared knowledge, be a form of distributism?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is something I'm really interested in, is how much can people do even within the current system to kind of withdraw from it to a certain extent. Now, you know, when you withdraw completely, that I think could be detrimental, and it might not attract as many people. So, I mean, this is something I think about a lot, but I think that there are gradations of withdrawal, and the cooperation amongst people to share what they have, their abilities, talents, the food that they grow, the machinery that they own. You know, these can help people become much more stronger and independent. You know, we have this fallacy in the United States anyway, and I think it's sort of a Western mentality that if you need other people, you are not an independent individual, right? But then you're at the mercy of the market for everything you need. So everybody on my block, if they're doing anything, they got a shed full of tools, right? Everybody on my block, you know, if they're doing any gardening, they're doing it on their own. You know, it's if difficult, if not impossible, even in your own neighborhood, to actually make contact with other people and have that conversation about, hey, you know, what can I do? What can I do for you, and what can you do for me? And I've developed a relationship like that with one neighbor across the street, and it's taught me the value of reciprocity. Cooperation is built on reciprocity, and meaning that, you know, it's legit. Like, you know, the charitable model is one model, but the reciprocal model is another. It's built on, I do something for you, you may do something very different from me, but we're both giving each other something that's valuable to the other, right? And through that cooperation, we don't need to go to the store as often. We don't maybe need to make as much money to work as hard as we do, right? So we can do that. We can conceivably do that even within the economy as it currently exists, but it's extremely hard because people's mentality has become so ingrained with the market, and with this weird skewed sense of individualism, in which it's wrong to take from others, and it's wrong to, if you can supply it for yourself, then you should. And, you know, if you don't have money, that's shameful, or, you know, it's superior to use money to buy what you need. And there's almost a pride. I don't know how many people I've dealt with over the years that felt like it would be a blow to their pride to need something from me. Okay. And yet this is what human relationships are literally built on, is needing things from other people. Like Aristotle said way back, you know, like, what is a community built on? It's built on the fact that not everybody can supply all of their needs, and people have to work together and cooperate. Okay. So I think it can be done, but it's hard. Yeah, I see somebody raising their hand there.
I raised it just a second ago. What you said about, I guess that like American pride over, you know, being your own individual. I'm just thinking of Death of the Salesman, where the whole crux of the plot there was, you know, he was too prideful to accept help from, you know, members of his community, and ultimately it led to his, you know, the tragedy in that play. Been a while since I've read it, so maybe I should go over it again.
That's a great recommendation. Yeah, and
That was a pretty good one.
Absolutely, it's very ingrained, you know, even in our own family members, right? To, like, whether it's your elderly parents who say, no way am I going to let you, like, take care of me in any possible way. I'm going to, like, go to an assisted living facility. Not that this is always a bad idea. Sometimes it's necessary because of the level of care needed. But a lot of times the insistence on doing that is based on this idea, I don't want to burden you. I don't want to need anybody. I don't want anybody interfering with my life either, right? And I want to be independent. And boy, you're not independent if you're living at an assisted living facility. I'm sorry, you're not. You're just dependent upon people who get paid. But this is the crazy mentality we've got. Is like, if I pay them, then I'm an independent person, right? And I have pride. That's great. You know, like Jeremy, I'm sure you'd agree with that. That's great for our growth, the growth of our economy, preying upon people's skewed sense of independence, right? But what could be more independent than a family actually, you know, cooperating? My parents live right next door. To this day, my dad and mom are like 94 and 93. I still benefit from the things that my dad does for me and my mom's company. And I give back through what I know about and can give to them. And we're both way better off as a result of that cooperation. Like if I had little kids, which I don't, I have a 24-year-old son now, but like if I had little kids, they would be excellent babysitters as well, that I would not have to pay for, right? But how could we have an ever-growing economy if people started to go fly under the radar and actually cooperate? It would be, if enough people did this, literally the system would be threatened, and there would probably be some sort of laws passed to prevent people. You know, for instance, they would say, you're not qualified to take care of your parents' needs. Okay. It's dangerous to grow your own garden. I had a conversation with a guy who's in the food safety industry last week, who was practically like foaming at the mouth at the thought that I would find growing stuff in my garden to be safer than buying like lettuce at a grocery store. He told me that if my cat like took a crap on my garden bed, that I could die. I mean, yeah, sure. haven't died yet. But you know, you see how that would suck the feeling of independence and self-sufficiency right out of a person to hear this. But I think this would happen. I mean, it's already happened, but it would happen more and more if people pushed back and started to take care of each other, because it would be a true threat to the economy as it exists. And to that extent, I would encourage all of you to do it. So we've got 2 more minutes. Let's see. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for pointing out that book. Sounds good. Time banking. Yeah, we tried time banking here. It didn't get off the ground, but I think that was because COVID hit and everybody kind of holed up, but we may try it again. It's a cool concept. It's facilitated by a website, but you basically put in what you can do, and other people do the same. And then you literally trade time credits. Like I will help you out with, like I helped somebody fill a hole in their wall, and then I got helped out. Somebody made a banner for my website, stuff like that. All right.
I have one last question. Would it be okay if I asked it?
Yeah, go ahead.
In recent land redistribution efforts, there's been not a lot of success, and usually I guess they're more Marxist or socialist in nature. Do the distributists have a clear plan for what a land redistribution policy would look like? Is there any practical application that we can look for, let's say, the United States? Because the United States has done land distribution somewhat successfully in the past, but obviously the Homesteading Act would look a lot different today. So what would a distributist say would be a practical application of land redistribution?
Yeah, I mean, Chesterton even said that people would need to be provided education and even materials by the government to get started again. The problem with land reform in some countries which has been disastrous, has been because it was so poorly thought out, where they just sort of sent people out, you know, here's your land, and didn't give them any sort of guidance or any sort of instruction. And of course, food production goes way down, and you have a famine. But yes, I think distributists would insist upon there being a sort of transition period in which people got the proper support, including knowledge, training, and equipment, to be able to do this type of work. You can't just throw people into diversified farming. There is quite a large learning curve there to do it right. It is, you know, also kind of instinctual, but you do have to be out there doing it for a while for those to kick in, right? Like one of the biggest aspects, I think, is just observation. Like you need to become observant, and you need to think in terms of causation. So you begin to observe, okay, this didn't work. This does work. Okay, I'll file that away for next year. This plant didn't get eaten to death by bugs. This one did. I think I'll keep those seeds, and just simple stuff like that. But you can't just like throw urban people onto a farm and expect that to work. Yeah. But it's not insurmountable. It's a matter of political will, social will, to do it. And it could be sold in the name of national security, because it is a national security issue. What could be more of a national security issue than making sure that each area of your country could get fed, even if the global supply chain got disrupted?
I almost think the United States is uniquely set up to be able to implement this sort of thing with our very strong Department of Agriculture and Extension agencies. So I feel like we could almost tackle it in a more successful way than a lot of other countries have tried in the past couple decades.
Right. We would just have to change their ideology at the Department of Agriculture. You know, like they're thoroughly, you know, like ingrained in the big ag way of thinking so far. Yeah, Jeremy.
So not only would we have to change the culture of USDA for something like that, we would also have to go back to actually funding our extension services. In most states, the extension services are losing both federal and state funding. And if they're not successful at competitive grant writing, a lot of extension offices are closing or consolidating because they don't have the support.
That's too bad. Yeah, because Andrew's got a great point there, that at least we had or had the infrastructure to be able to do it if we could push that information out and, you know, the supports necessary. But I guess it doesn't surprise me that, you know, the funding for this is being reduced, because the corporate people have basically taken over that job. All right, well, we are out of time and I don't want to run too far over, but join us in Slack. If you didn't get it before, before you leave, Bryant did leave links that you can click on now to get to Slack and go ahead and get into the Google Drive as well. So go ahead and do that. I'll stay on for another minute so you can if you want to, but otherwise, I hope you guys have a good week, and I'm looking forward to week 4. And that's where we're going to get into the Catholic worker movement, right? And Dorothy Day. So I've been looking forward to this one and learning from you guys as well. So you guys take care. Bye. Bye.